AI.
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 Everybody's saying AI is going to change everything. If you don't use AI, you're going to lose out. You've all got to buy AI.
Is the AI bubble popping?
Threat of a bubble. An AI bubble burst.
Reality check could be coming for AI valuation.
And then we're going to have a slump on the other side because very few of these companies are going to survive. It looks like OpenAI, which one of the original companies may well fold.
Another day of tech underperformance on some concerns about AI growth.
So we're going to see large-scale bankruptcies coming out of the AI world, particularly if China ends up beating America in that front by having lower energy usage and better algorithms to do things with less energy consumption, then that's going to be even more damaging. Not something on the scale of the global financial crisis. When that happened, that was all a private debt-driven bubble, classic Hyman Minsky stuff. A huge amount of credit-based money demand going into the economy for asset purchases. When the asset prices start to plunge, the credit goes negative. We went from a huge level of positive credit to a huge level of negative credit, and that's what caused the downturn. This time round, it's not that strongly debt-driven, and I don't expect the same sort of scale of downturn as we saw in the global financial crisis, but I do expect a recession when the AI investment fails, so lots of AI companies fold, and then undercuts many conventional production processes where it can be used. So you get robots being used in factories rather than workers and things like that. Then it's going to cause a slump. The other transformational thing about AI, which is important, is that a large part of the reason why people have jobs was that companies need bureaucracies. Marx had this idea when he wrote the Das Kapital. Capitalism was going to divide into two groups. You'd have wealthy capitalists and everybody else would be a wage slave. There'd be massive unemployment as well because you would have capitalist efficiency eliminating many middle-class jobs. Well, in fact, what you got was a dramatic expansion of the middle class. And this is partly because firms need a bureaucracy. The government needs a bureaucracy as well. So there were jobs in a bureaucratic setting that expanded dramatically. And managing a large firm takes a huge bureaucracy. So you had a growth in middle-class jobs and a shrinkage in working-class jobs, nothing like what Marx was expecting. But now if you look at what AI can do, one of the reasons you need clerical staff and you need process workers in factories is that there are things which are too expensive to mechanize. So you could make a computer that took the place of your clerk, but too bloody complicated, you won't do it. And you could have made a machine that took the place of a manual labor, but the cost of producing the machine is so high you don't bother doing it. It's cheaper to pay for a worker. And one of my favorite examples there, by the way, came out in the New York Times at the time of the financial crisis. They went to a factory, which was an air conditioning manufacturing factory, and just saw the impact of the downturn on their sales. But they interviewed a woman whose job it was to put what's called a thermocouple, the little, this looks like a hairpin, into each of the air conditioning units so that there was a temperature regulating system. And she manually had to put about 2,000 or 3,000 of those each day because that's how many air conditioning units the factory produced on a daily basis. And she said, you don't have to love your job so long as it pays your money. She was, satisfied with a boring job. But of course, once you get a robot, you can train the robot to do it and then the robot takes the place of that person. And what this is going to mean is as robotics gets developed, we're already seeing things like Boston Dynamics and Tesla robots and Chinese robots and so on. They're getting incredible manual dexterity, massive degrees of freedom in how the hands can move, just like in Terminator. In Terminator 2 where Arnie fights the T-1000 and the T-1000 gets thrown against a wall and then simply walks out the metal Well, that sort of thing is possible, not with the liquid metal, but that's what those Boston robots can do now. So what it means is you can easily train a robot to take the place of that worker. If it's cheaper to buy the robot and pay the electricity that the robot consumes rather than hiring the worker and paying wage the worker needs to live, then you're going to eliminate all those process line jobs. And you're also going to have the same thing happening in clerical positions because as bad as AI can be at doing stuff like that, so you could actually eliminate a huge part of the clerical work as well. And that means that the income distribution upon which capitalism has depended, which is capitalists earn a profit, workers earn a wage, that's not going to happen anymore. Potentially. So there's no need to hire workers anymore. Now, what that means is it doesn't just a cyclical shift, it's a complete breakdown in the income distribution system that's been part of capitalism since its establishment. So if that does actually happen, then a large part of the population will have no income source. And that is something which is obviously being thought about by some of the Silicon Valley bros on this front because they're talking about a universal basic income. Ironically, the people who may bring in a universal basic income may be the tech bros who are totally anti-government, because they realise if they actually have a technology which eliminates the working class, then they eliminate their market as well. They don't just use the workers, they lose the consumers. And unless they provide a way for the consumers to have an income to buy the goods, they won't make a profit or anything like the profit they're calculating on. So if that shift does occur before we destroy the physical productivity of the planet through climate change, it's quite possible in that world that we'll have to have a complete rethinking of how we allocate income, because at the moment people are very much against the idea of giving people money just for the heck of it. But if you undermine the capacity for workers to earn a wage and work, then you're going to have to replace it with something else. And the only other something else that makes sense is a universal basic income. You'll see Musk talking about a universal high income. It's a huge shift. It could lead to a world in which we have basically plenty for everybody, because what makes us wealthy is the amount of energy we consume. You've now got these robots that can replace the slaves we used to use, replace the workers as well. We could all benefit from it. We can have a higher standard of living, but we're going to get caught in all the usual conflicts over the distribution of income that have marked capitalism for its entire history. And I have a feeling there'll be a lot of resistance to this idea of making the income worthwhile. So at one extreme, if we do it properly, yes, you can have universal high income for everybody because we're all getting the benefit of the robots doing the work for us. But at the other extreme, you end up in the Hunger Games. And that's what worries me. I think we've got that potential to end up in a world in which you try to have an elite that lives an extremely wealthy, opulent lifestyle, and everybody else is suppressed by military that makes them keep in line and they get barely enough to survive. That's the dilemma we face with this particular change, that we have two completely different sliding door futures and there's no guarantee as to which one we're going to end up in. The AI is a bit more like the classic sort of cycle that Schumpeter spoke about when he wrote one of the most brilliant books in economics called The Theory of Economic Development. And what he was trying to explain is how you get cyclical behaviour out of the nature of investment in a capitalist economy. And it included the role of money, but it also was talking about how new technology gets developed and how you make a profit because of it. So Schumpeter was someone who sort of accepted the neoclassical vision for equilibrium, but he said that in equilibrium there's no profit. And this is something which mainstream economists don't really get their heads around, because they talk about what they call economic profit. And economic profit is a return above what everybody else gets. The normal rate of return, they talk about that being zero economic profit. To get an economic profit, you've got to get a return above the level that's the average for capitalists as a whole. And he said the only way you can do that, if you're actually in equilibrium, there is no profit, no economic profit. So the economic profit, you've got to disrupt the system somehow. And that makes a break with current systems. Several ways that can happen. You can bring about a new technology, and obviously AI is an example of that. You can secure a new source of minerals, which reduces your costs and so on and so forth. But the main one is this idea of a new technology. So how do you make a profit out of a new technology? Schumpeter, I think, was absolutely brilliant in this argument, because it's all verbal, but he didn't make a single logical error in the whole process. So he said the way that entrepreneur makes a profit is that they have to come up with a technology which, when it's implemented, is going to undercut existing systems. So the example that he gave is the spinning jenny. And if you go back to how clothing was made before the spinning jenny was invented, then you had one worker working on one spinning wheel. And the spinning jenny began with one worker working on 6 wheels. Okay? Now that meant that if you could produce 6 times as much output as a single worker, or replace 6 workers with 1 worker in a machine, then so long as the cost of the machine, amortized cost, depreciation and so on, was less than the cost of the 5 workers, and so long as the impact of you increasing supply didn't depress the price of the market price too much when it first started, you'd make a profit. So you displace existing technology. So you start with an entrepreneur, and the way that Schumpeter described an entrepreneur actually made it harder for him to develop his argument, because he assumed that entrepreneurs don't have any money of their own. So an entrepreneur has to borrow money from a bank, and then when they borrow that money, that causes an expansion of economic activity in general. So you've got to hire workers away from existing positions, rent machinery away from existing uses, and therefore you increase prices. So you saw when it first happens, there's a boom in the development phase. But then when you develop the technology, it comes online, it undercuts the existing systems, and you then cause a recession. So you had a boom and recession cycle. And he argued that the technology which is developed during a boom phase is actually implemented into the fabric of production and therefore replacing current systems during a slump. And I read it and I thought, this doesn't seem right to me. I don't think it's true that the technology is implemented in the slump afterwards. But then, of course, that was the period of the telecommunications boom that sort of preceded the internet bubble as well. And then you had the subprime bubble after that. When the telecommunication was being laid, people were laying optical fibre everywhere. And there was so many people laying optical fibre that the volume of optical fibre that was laid in the American economy was about 10 times what was necessary. And therefore, 90% of it was actually left in the state that they call dark fibre, because to make optical fibre work, you don't just need the optical fibre, you need a laser. You've got to attach a laser to send light signals down the cable. And people didn't bother. So you have all this huge investment in telecommunications, laying cables everywhere, multiple companies doing it in the same region, lots of them go bust. And then in the aftermath, of course, you've got only a handful of companies that survived that process. There's no point in investment anymore because there's been too much investment beforehand. There's too much cable laid. When the technology becomes so cheap, everybody buys access to the technology because as well as the overproduction during the boom phase, and the people losing money and going bankrupt and only a couple of people surviving, a couple of manufacturers, you've got all this extra capacity everywhere. It's cheap for other industries to buy, so therefore that technology does get integrated into the rest of the economy during the slump that follows the boom that was caused by the investment cycle in the first place. So I think in that sense, what we're seeing with AI is a classic Schumpeterian bubble, that you've had a massive investment. And now, of course, it's not true that those companies had to borrow money to do it, but because there's so many, Google does it, and you've got all these well-funded AIs as well. They're not necessarily borrowing bank money, but they're spending large amounts of their cash reserves. So it's got a similar impact. So you get a general boom for the entire economy, massive overproduction. There's far too many companies producing AI, but at the same time, what are people using it for? They're using to make cartoons of Donald Trump. People aren't going to pay money to do that. They'll do it when it's free, and you do it when it's free initially because the companies are trying to encourage people to use the AI. So it's either extremely cheap or totally free, and therefore there's usage, but nobody's making a profit out of it. If you actually want to charge money for people doing AI, you'll get far less volume. And that's going to be a real irony for these tech bros to get caught up in, because they've mainly been talking about how evil the government is and we'd be better off without a government, but they're creating a world which can't work unless there is a government creating the money and giving it to people, and not for work, but to stay alive. And in some ways, people who are currently anti-government are going to have to become pro-government and then understand how the government functions, and maybe they might give me a call. That'd be good.
If you've been feeling that something is off with the economy and this helped you put your finger on what it was, you're probably like the 22,000 others who recently requested one of my 3 books inside my new Ravel Economist book bundle. The bundle is worth $50, but you can get it while it's free this week. Click the link in the description or go to stevekeen.com. Once there, click on the black button, enter your email, and in about 60 seconds, we'll email you free access. After that, if you want to study with me personally with live lectures each week and use the proprietary tool you saw me use in this video called Ravel, there'll be an optional invite to apply and join my private group of like-minded economic rebels. Again, that's stevekeen.com or click the link in the description.